Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. Thank you all for attending IoT on 5G and the release of our Halcyon principles for connected intelligent technologies. My name is Josh Mandell. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Halcyon. We were the convener for the authoring of these principles. Just to tell you a little bit about Halcyon, we support emerging innovators and artists striving to create a better world. So we have a social enterprise incubator here in Washington where we bring fellows from all over the world with startups. We do the same thing for emerging artists. We have a citywide art and dialogue festival, and we're headquartered out of the historic Halcyon House in Georgetown. So I invite you all to check out what we do, because we are not your typical nonprofit. Excellent. So I'm just going to compete with this panel and see if... So this is Jessie Blumenthal. She is going to... All right. So let's just pretend that's not happening and focus on me. Okay. Can they hear us? Hey, how are you guys doing in the next room? Great. Okay. So look, we are in the age of the internet, and things turn out are interconnected. Case in point, we haven't got this down to a science, so that's what we're here to talk about. I first of all want to thank our partner InterDigital for helping to sponsor and pull together this incredible group. And of course, I want to make sure that everyone has a copy of their Halcyon principles to digest. It's only a short 8 pages, so very easy to consume. I just wanted to introduce Eric, who's going to be introducing the panel. He's really the ideal person to be doing this. He's done considerable time in government, in the private sector, in academia, and of course was one of the principal authors of the Halcyon principles. He's the CEO and founder of Conexus. They're a data management and integration tool that is as far as I can get as far as understanding how it works, but it's really interesting, and he's going to tell you a little bit about that. He's got a new book coming out, which is called Every Business is an AI Business, which I'm really looking forward to reading. And I would like to welcome Eric Daimler to introduce the panel. Thank you very much.
I want some video accompaniment here. All right, well, good afternoon. I hope you all have a good lunch. Thanks for showing up for the panel right first after lunch. I appreciate that. I can tell a story about 2016. I saw what was probably going to be the largest oval-shaped rug that I will ever see in my life. And what was memorable about this, not just because of the shape of the rug, but because of what was inscribed around the outside. There was a few sayings that were kind of embedded in the edge of the rug, many of which we would recognize as kind of popular American sayings. I forgot most of them, but I remember one. It was the long arc of history bends towards justice. Bends, get it? Bends towards justice, right? Oval rug. And I don't remember it just because that I've heard the phrase before. It's a popular phrase. Many of us have heard it before. But for what came after. And President Obama said, but not without our involvement. The long arc of history bends towards justice, but not without our involvement. And I bring that up because that's relevant to our conversation today, where we are talking about the implementation of large-scale internet-connected devices. We're talking about policies and procedures and a framework for discussing the implementation of these technologies. That's what we're going to be discussing on our panel today. So I want to cover a couple of things. One is I want to talk about some terms. I want to define some terms that we're going to be discussing today. Next, in order to facilitate the dialogue, I actually want to make an argument that AI and interconnected devices are underhyped. They deserve all the hype. The privacy and security deserve all the digital ink that's given to them, but I think we have more to say about that. And then third, I want to talk about the principles themselves, and we'll introduce the principles about which we're going to have a conversation for the next little bit. So if we think of digital connected devices, if we think of 5G, if we think of AI, you might have in your mind what these things are, or maybe to the effect of what your grandma might say about AI. If you're going to ask your grandma what AI is, what might come to mind if you think of AI? You're going to shout it out. What comes to mind if you think of artificial intelligence?
All the stuff we don't understand.
All the stuff you don't understand? Good. What else about AI?
Marketing hype.
Marketing hype, very good. What else about AI? What comes to mind? Close the pod door, Hal, yeah. Jobs, yeah. These are all things around AI. You might think of machine learning. Some people think about the Terminator, right? These are things that come up to mind with AI. For the purposes of this conversation, I'd invite a broad definition of AI, just a broader perspective of what AI is. And I'm going to say it's a system. Again, this is just something you can try on. You can go back to any other definition once you leave, but for the purpose of this conversation, AI is a system that senses, plans, and acts, and then learns from that experience. So the sensing could be anything. It could be the LiDAR on top of your car. It could be the air quality in this room. It's anything that collects data. So that's the sensing. We can sense from the billion internet-connected devices that we now have. I mean, how many people have the 24-hour microphones in their house? I mean, speakers in their house. Yeah. It collects data. That's what data comes in. It could come from anywhere, but that's how data is collected. There's an Internet of Things, billion connected devices, right? Collecting data. The data then gets transmitted through a network. The network could be the big pipes in your office. It also could be the 10x order of magnitude improvement in our mobile technology that we often just shorthand as 5G, right? So collect data, goes through a network, then goes to be processed. Silicon and storage facilitate the learning algorithms. Right? So I used to be faculty at Carnegie Mellon, at Stanford, University of Washington, Seattle. We developed learning algorithms, and that could be a strict way. But once we collect the data, we bring it through the pipe, we process the data, and then we act on the data. That whole system then learns. We call that AI. Now, in the strict sense, we might say that artificial intelligence has a subset that many people know about called machine learning. A subset of that, an expression, is deep learning. So deep learning is an algorithm inside of machine learning, which is a subset of machine learning, and they're not non-machine learning AIs. Anybody get that? It's not really useful. That's true. That's actually the proper definition, but it's pedantic and not terribly helpful to this conversation. So that's what we're going to be talking about. The issue about hype or underhyped is generally that we confuse a clear vision for a short time horizon. Everybody knows when you see autonomous vehicles using the advanced cruise control that they can envision then flying cars. And that'll somehow happen in the next 10 years. But what people don't know, anybody want to guess about when the first car was on the road in the United States autonomously, on a public road, stopping at stop signs by itself? 93, we got 93. Any other guesses? Anybody for 89? 88? 87? 84? 82. 1982. This stuff's been around for a long time. This was in Pittsburgh. It was a big van. It went very slowly. But it's legitimately stopped. Legitimately was on public roads. The point of that is we've had for 30 or 40 years, we've had autonomous vehicles. So this is not something that's been around quickly. Don't confuse a clear vision for a short time horizon. Next is we're competing on data. A lot of things are becoming commodities as we import data, as we process data, export data. We're competing on data. A lot of things are being commoditized. And it's in that sense that everything's going to become a type of AI business. And it's in that sense that it's actually difficult to imagine the hype, it's difficult to imagine the possibilities. And that's why the hype in some respects, but in different expressions than artificial intelligence, than autonomous vehicles, can be justified. So next we want to talk about the nature of these principles. There is going to be no dystopia There is going to be no utopia. It's kind of a type of lazy thinking that the future is going to be between those extremes. And this is the conversation we have today, is where in that process, without our involvement, will it be the latter or will it be the former? That's what we're going to be talking about. You know, when we're used to these sort of principles in other contexts, we have these principles that many will be familiar with if we saw them on a building. The LEED standards, right? Platinum, silver, gold. We may not know what they mean. We may not even necessarily agree with them, but at least those are standards. It's a framework that's out there. So without our involvement, we want to be engaging in this process of what principles are. Don't just tell me what you don't want, tell me what you want. And this is actually vital for American competitiveness, if not just the survival of Western civilization, because we need to be embracing the technology. We need to be channeling the technology, you know, not just reacting to it and then resisting it. So let me get on with the 4 principles. We have them in your book. I'll shorthand them for you. So the first one, I might think of this way. Has anybody actually read an end-user license agreement, a EULA? Okay. This being the district, I should have predicted that, I suppose. You guys probably, some of you probably wrote them, I guess, I suppose. Yeah, well, congratulations, reading a EULA kind of end-to-end is pretty tough. We get them all the time. I ask a follow-up question. How do we know if a company is violating the EULA? And the answer is we don't. There's really no way of mechanizing, of automating that. There's also really very little legal recourse. We can yell and scream, but there's very little legal recourse if a company violates the EULA. So the first principle is declare what the technology is. Is it doing what it said it did, what it's supposed to do? That's the first principle. Second principle, we might think of in context of restaurants. So I've heard it said that, you know, for restaurants, you got quality, you got location, you got price. Pick 2. So in this sense, we might think of security, privacy, and convenience. We have trade-offs. We make trade-offs every day, all day. Security, privacy, and convenience. What were the trade-offs in the technical development of these products? I may not agree. I just want them to be declared. So that's the second principle. Third principle is that these technologies should be pro-social. We've seen the repercussions of many of these technologies be unintended from what we think was the original purpose. So it's helpful just to declare what the pro-social purpose of these technologies were. We may not agree, but we should revisit those. We declare them and then revisit them. Then the fourth principle is that the future is interconnectedness. We don't need more walled gardens. So we may not agree, but at least declare how is this going to be interconnected? How is this technology facilitating interconnectedness? So those are the 4 principles. 1, did the technology do what it says? 2nd, what were the trade-offs? What were the inherent trade-offs? 3rd, is it pro-social? How is it so pro-social? And then 4th, how is it interconnected? So those are the four principles about which we're going to talk today. We have a fantastic, perfectly appropriate panel to be having this discussion. And with that, I will introduce our panel moderator, Clara. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was a wonderful introduction to the Halcyon principles. And I did want to say we have an excellent panel of incredibly smart people from different aspects of society, from the Hill, from representing a number of technology companies, all the way to entrepreneurs and public servants that have looked at this space from a policy lens. So with that, I did want everyone to do a quick introduction. From my end, my name's Clara Tsao. I formerly was the Senior Advisor for Emerging Technology at Department of Homeland Security, where we looked a lot at emerging devices from a critical infrastructure standpoint. And I also was an advisor to the Halcyon principles here today. I did want to pass the mic down first to Sasha to do a quick introduction, and then we'll go from left to right. Yeah.
You're on.
Great. My name is Sasha.
There's a button that should turn green.
Sorry.
Sorry, technical difficulties. My name is Sasha. I work for Congresswoman Suzan DelBene from Washington State.
Hold the mic closer, please.
Great.
Previously, I worked for Senator Cantwell on her commerce portfolio. And prior to that, I spent 10 years in the technology private sector in both big tech and small businesses. So currently, my main focus on the Hill is federal privacy legislation, which has been getting a lot of buzz around there with a lot of the new articles that come around, for example, Clearview and so on. But also, my boss is the co-chair of the Internet of Things caucus to educate members of Congress on what the Internet of Things actually is and why it's important. And she's co-chair of the Women in High Tech Coalition, so focus on a lot of different tech issues.
Thank you so much, Sasha. And next we have Jamie. Jamie, do you want to give a quick introduction?
Great. Hi, I'm Jamie Susskind. I am the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the Consumer Technology Association. For those of you who don't know CTA, we represent about 2,200 companies across a really big tech ecosystem. And as our CEO Gary likes to say, every company is a tech company. We just finished CES, so for those of you who were there, you got to see a lot of the cool innovations. I guess AI was the buzzword there and everywhere, so that's a big focus for folks in our space right now. So prior to that, I was the Chief of Staff for Commissioner Brendan Carr at the Federal Communications Commission, and before that, I worked on the Senate side on Capitol Hill. I worked for Senator Deb Fischer, where I handled Commerce Committee and Judiciary issues for her, including spearheading her work on the Senate Internet of Things Working Group with 3 other senators. And I also spent some time working for Senator John Thune, where I handled a lot of different issues for him, but mostly on the telecom and tech side of things. But happy to be here and to chat with all the great members of this panel.
Great. And Katie, representing a lot of civil society think tanks.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me on the panel. I'm Katie Jordan, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Internet Society. So I work on all of our policy initiatives in North America, which covers everything from access for tribal communities or indigenous communities to security. And for the purposes of this panel, one of the things that I've been working on for the last 2 years is our IoT security initiatives, both globally and specifically in Canada, working with multi-stakeholder groups or collaborative groups to figure out how we can address some of the fragmentation in the policy landscape around IoT and how we can take tangible steps using the members of the group's unique expertise to address specific aspects of security. Better? Thanks. We'll keep sharing. We'll just move it back and forth. Sure. So I'm very excited to be on this panel to talk more about some of the specific things that we've done and how that lines up with the Halcyon principles.
Fantastic. And Eric, do you want to give a quick introduction? I know we've heard a little bit about you, but if you wanted to say anything else.
Yeah, so I've been involved. All right, I've been involved in the system that is AI for a few decades now, as an academic researcher, like I had said, but also I've started 6 companies. I've been a venture capitalist on Sand Hill Road, and I was the good fortune of working with the Obama administration in the last year as their AI person within the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So policy, investment, and research. It's me.
Fantastic. So Eric had kicked off by talking a little bit about the Halcyon principles. And I did want us to break the conversation to say these principles are not the only types of principles out there. There are many frameworks. And so maybe, Sasha, you could start off by talking a little bit about the work that the IoT caucus is doing on the Hill, some of the latest privacy work that is really integral to something like this.
Sure. I mean, the main point of the IoT caucus is that the Hill doesn't really understand technology issues the way they need to in order to regulate them or in order to at least come up with their own set of principles. So generally speaking, we rely on outside groups to kind of collect these principles, these best practices. We rely on industry, we rely on think tanks, academia, and so on to collect things like these main 4 principles that we can then disseminate into some sort of a regulatory framework. For example, the Congresswoman that I work for has a privacy bill that creates a regulatory framework through the FTC to kind of bring up a lot of these issues like data portability and data localization and data security and so on. And that's just one aspect. We work with, all outside groups. We work with the Internet Society, for example, and CTA, and we work with anyone who has sets of principles like these. They're extremely important on the Hill, and I don't know what else you need from that, but yeah, education is extremely important for the members of Congress on the Hill who didn't necessarily come from technology as their background.
What is the general sentiment right now on the Hill on this topic? Just a pulse of the landscape.
Big tech is the boogeyman. If there's anything scary in the media or anything that comes out of a narrative that they're unsure of or unclear about, they point their finger at big tech, which we've seen there are some reasons for that, but there's a few actors in the space that ruined it for everyone. Not all of the industry is out to get consumer data to use it in a nefarious way. I think we spoke about this prior to the panel. Self-reporting and self-regulating may not be the best thing for big tech right now, or technology in general, because it allows consumers to still have that fear factor in front of them. So allowing the FTC to set up some sort of rulemaking with public comment and so on from industry, from academia, from think tanks to set up that framework might actually in turn help the technology industry rather than just letting them continue on their way, because it will provide consumers with a little more clarity and will diminish that fear that they see based on what the media is portraying right now.
No, thank you for that quick overview. So Jamie, I know that we had talked separately about some of the other principles that you have rolled out through CTA, specifically around healthcare. Would love to hear about your learnings there and how that could apply to something like this for IoT.
Great. So I should say we're not the big bad boogeyman, but understand why that might be the sentiment these days. So at CTA, I would say that we are big believers in, number one, the idea that there's tech for good out there, right? We look at all the innovations out there in this space and all of the good that's been made possible through what our companies are doing. And I think we're just really, really proud of all of that and continue to tout that. That said, I think that we understand as an organization that there are fears out there. There's fears about where consumer data is being used and if privacy is being appropriately protected. There's concerns about data security, data breaches happening all the time, and we get that. So, at CTA, we've really tried to be leaders in this space. And so I think that our work has been kind of twofold. One, on the security side, I won't call it principles, right? Because I was actually chatting with some panelists before we started here and said that it's more technical than that. So we've referred to it kind of as capabilities. But we, along with US Telecom, which is another tech and telecom association in this space, convened a group of 13 stakeholders to create an association called the Council to Secure the Digital Economy. And so together we've tried to do a lot on the security side. Probably most notably is convening 20 groups together to create a baseline for IoT device security. We called our effort C2, which stands for Convene the Conveners. And we actually published a document late last year. It's technical, as I say, so it sort of makes all the technical engineer folks in the room happy to look at it and sort of flummoxes me. But, I think we recognize working in concert with the administration that there's just a need for this. And as I said, I won't call it principles, but I think that, the idea is out there that we need to make sure that companies are being responsible stewards of consumer data and, use that in a responsible way and be accountable to consumers. On the other side of things, we have publicly advocated for federal privacy legislation, and I'm not going to pretend I'm the expert on that on my team because there's two other people who sort of do that before me. But we've advocated for a federal framework that takes risk profiles into account when you're regulating how that data is used. We have stressed that whatever framework is put in place needs to ensure that companies still maintain the freedom to innovate And we do want to make sure that the FTC maintains its appropriate role as the enforcers on the federal side of things. And so, as you said, Clara, we also, late last year, put out some healthcare privacy principles for a lot of our members, which they got together. We have a lot of actually members in the digital health space. And so this is for them to voluntarily and flexibly think about how to responsibly use consumer healthcare data and make sure that the data is being safeguarded and used in an appropriate way.
Oh, fantastic. And Katie, I know that you mentioned earlier you've done a lot of meetings internationally. Would love to hear what the international landscape is thinking about this issue. And we talked a lot about American competitiveness, the need for standards, the need for consumer protection here, but would love to hear about what the conversations have been like in Canada and other working groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the conversation's been really interesting, and we took a much more narrow kind of set of guidelines to our work than I think that Halcyon principles did. And we started with our Canadian group. We had about 100 individuals representing 80 different organizations and agencies and things like that. And we spent almost a whole day just trying to figure out what we were talking about when we said IoT. And that was where we started, was that there is so much confusion even among experts, about what really we need to be looking at when we are talking about security and privacy of these devices. And so our group ultimately decided to start with very narrow focus and look at consumer devices, the things that you would think about, like your toaster and your fridge, as opposed to your phone and your laptop. And in looking at those devices and really looking at just the security aspects, we realized that there are kind of three buckets of things that we should be doing. One, and it's really first and foremost, is consumer education and awareness. There are so many of these devices going into the marketplace, and the consumers that are buying them do not necessarily understand that there's a risk in the first place. And I think that that's across the board. In every country that we work with, that really is the number one problem, is that you don't know, a lot of users don't know they have a problem. So we have to work with civil society and governments and technologists to address that. And a couple of ways you can do that would be through a label, for example. And that's one of the things the Canadian group spent a lot of time working on, was what a label, a security label, might actually look like. And that group ultimately decided that it should be a combination of things, where you have both a static label that says this has been reviewed and it is certified by some sort of trusted body as, at this moment in time, it is deemed secure. But we know that these devices are susceptible to breaches and they're susceptible to hacks and things like that. So you need something that gives a live update as well. So the label would have to include some kind of a QR code where a consumer could scan it and figure out what's happened at this moment in time, as opposed to the moment in time where it's been deemed secure. And the last piece would be network resiliency, where there has to be an element of this security where we're really focused on the networks as a whole to prevent botnet attacks, so that we're not risking our infrastructure at the same time we're risking consumer privacy and security. So this group wrapped up its work in May of 2018, and a similar initiative was carried out in many different countries in many different regions around the world. So we've got processes happening in Senegal and in Uruguay and in France and other countries. And so what we decided to do was, as each of these developed, they looked at really similar pieces, but they're slightly different depending on the context. And so we created a more global group to address some of that fragmentation. But I would still say that the fundamental issues we addressed through the Canadian group are true around the world. And there's some really basic things that we could be doing to make devices more secure, like not putting universal, easy to guess passwords on every device one manufacturer makes. That's super easy, and it seems like there's pretty much consensus globally that that's a good step to take. So we've got a 90-page document from the Canadian process that dives into all sorts of very specific details you can take. But I think there's a lot more global consensus on kind of the baseline principles than there is disagreement, which is good.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. And Eric, obviously, you've spent a lot of time in the startup world. You've spent a lot of time in policy circles. Would love to hear, your thoughts on the current dialogue and discussion among companies, and whether these principles are something that they have the appetite to do. What is the sentiment in Silicon Valley and companies?
Yeah, I live in Silicon Valley, but I'd hate to speak for Silicon Valley. I can tell you, my experience of the zeitgeist is I am hugely encouraged by this idea of moving fast but modestly and being agile with whatever regulations we have, rather than studying, and then having large regulation. Because the biggest thing about technology is even somebody that spends all day, every day in this domain, my understanding of this technology has changed. Obviously, since 2016 in the way that we all recognize. But even in the last 3 years, I was just at a very large ride-share company that out in San Francisco, and they even said that 3 years ago, just 3 years ago, their understanding of their own business and how they capture this data and work with data has changed. 3 years ago. These are for people that do this all day, every day. So I think we need to have some intellectual modesty and some flexibility in implementing these regulations to understand that our understanding of what these technologies will mean to us will change in 2023. And that we need to all be engaged in that conversation. I think the biggest issue, this is what I could encourage, is that companies actually want to know, my company's probably less exposed to the most, but many companies want to know what the public wants. You know, they want to know. There was this, I get to one quick story. There was this guy, Ken Fidland, that he wrote this paper in 1972 about tax policy, and you can stay with me, it relates. He wrote this about tax policy saying, what's the right level of taxes? Is it 30%, 40%, 70%? His answer was none of those. What matters more than anything else to a company is predictability. He won, 20 years later, he won a Nobel Prize for this discovery, but what he wants is visibility. He doesn't want volatility in tax rates because that discourages investment, because it increases risk. And so that's what I would say is the zeitgeist, is we have a very big concern about regulation.
Can I respond? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think I agree with your point about flexibility. So, I mean, for us in my association, we are really supportive of industry-led efforts. And like, I know people will look at me and be like, well, of course you are, because you don't want to do anything, right? Like, you don't want to have to adhere to regulation. But really, it's because, as you say, the industry is changing. Every innovation's happening every second, right? We have to have the flexibility to be able to respond to it, and respond to it in a way where we're still giving consumers the products that they want. And not to say that there isn't an appropriate role for government. I think we've certainly tried to work with government on the security side and on the privacy side, but at the same time, flexibility to innovate is paramount.
Can I also jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So I would just say on that same point that, there's a role for regulators and policymakers, but I think it's also an evolving role. And one of the things that the Canadian group in particular has come to the conclusion is that maybe what we need to look at is standards, and setting really strong security standards from an industry perspective and from kind of a baseline technology perspective as the first step. And so that group is really approaching both the network resiliency and the labeling aspect through standards making bodies, as opposed to through kind of a regulator or through their parliament, which I've thought was really interesting, because it does, a standard is fairly rigid, but it takes a very different approach than a regulation would. And that's not to say that they won't also at some point, come up with some sort of law or regulation around this. But I thought it was very interesting that their perspective was to start more at that granular level.
So if I may, I think we need to be careful with standards, not just because of the temporal aspect that our understanding will change, but actually they're also contextual. I don't care about my password to my newspaper, but I care very much about my password to my bank. I care very much about safety at Boeing, safety in my e-commerce accounts. That's kind of irrelevant. So it's contextual around which we have these standards. I can make a point. There was research around passwords that gets to this issue. So we all are encouraged to have, we're increasingly encouraged to have these very strict password controls. I need a symbol, I need a number, I need a capital letter. And I'm like, really? I just want to order a dog food bowl. It's just unnecessary. But that's the standards of when people think, I don't want to be the company that gets their database leaked all over, so I enforce these standards. The research says that if you do that, people will actually have simpler passwords. They'll have the same passwords over and over. So it's counterproductive. What you should instead do, the research says, is you should allow people to have whatever they want, but then you should just tell them. This is a bad password. This is a bad password. You see some sites doing this. There's a weak password. There's a moderate password. There's a stronger password. That's what the research suggests you do. So I'm reluctant to be there with standards, or reluctant to endorse them. It's because of the different nuances.
Yeah, curious, Sasha, if you have your thoughts there. I see you about to jump on the mic.
Yes, so I think I'm the only person here from the government. So obviously I'm pro having a government role in this space. However, I completely agree that having a fluid enough model within the current federal government structure is hard to imagine. I don't know if we're future-proofing our regulations far enough. For example, we're still using the 1996 Communications Decency Act for all technology regulation. It's great. Well, where we're in 2020 now, and if we're writing a law or regulation, we really should be writing for what we don't know yet. So for what's going to happen in 2030, whatever regulation we start vetting now is going to apply to whatever comes out of industry, or R&D or whatever it may be in 2030, 2040, and so on. So, I mean, while I understand the concept of standards, I do think that having maybe federal agencies work on them, they tend to be a little more nimble than Congress is. They have, hopefully we can get them the resources and expertise that they need in order to do their job. But when it comes to your point on, your bank account password matters more than you use your Giant card and you put in your phone number and they track what you buy. I agree. However, in 10 years, what is our biggest commodity that we're going to be using? Is it big data? Is having access to that data going to be important down the road? We don't know what we don't know. So my hesitation on blanketing that this data doesn't matter more or less, this data matters less than that data is a little scary for me from the government side. I think there is sensitive data that we can define now, and more publicly known information, absolutely, depending on the person, depending on if you're a public figure or a private citizen or so on. But I think that's, you summed it up at the very beginning perfectly. The definitions of what we're talking about matter. And I think if we can find the definition of what sensitive information is now, what sensitive information or publicly available information is to the public, at least that's a starting point. So
yeah, and Sasha, I know that 5G is a big conversation on the Hill right now, and there's a lot of implications for the output of 5G on internet-connected devices. So would love for you to share a little bit on how the thinking is around that intersection, if there is.
Yes. So to be honest, the thought process that at least I have had on 5G and the government is the antitrust role of some of these companies coming in and going through mergers to try to make sure that they have the spectrum availability to provide 5G at a rapid pace. And I personally think we need to get out of our own way. And that's obviously my own view. I'm not speaking for the Congresswoman today. But I think that with the FCC going through some of their big auctions and kind of reshuffling where the spectrum availability is will really help. But I don't work on that committee, so I don't want to step in it too far.
So one of the big themes that we talked about is really the end outcome of how consumers understand what they see. There can be regulation, there can be standards set at different levels, but I would love to hear from each of you guys, what should we do to really get consumers aware? There have been very limited efforts of consumers knowing how their data is used and it becomes even more of a black box to more and more vendors and players that come through a supply chain. So I don't know who wants to take that one first.
I can answer this. I'll try to be brief about this. It's not actually about the data, sensitive or not sensitive. The example is how we treat it, how we relate to it. But what's actually much scarier is the reading and the writing of metadata. So I was creating learning algorithms at one time to detect terrorist networks. And you might think, well, that was a great cause. We then applied it to tax evasion, and you might get a little more queasy. If I then applied it to credit scores, then you might say, well, that introduces this concept of bias. So what if I had a learning algorithm and it looked at all possible data and it didn't say, well, people that didn't live in the zip code or didn't have this education were less creditworthy? What if I said people were less creditworthy if they had a red car? And then worse, you didn't know actually that was a characteristics of yours that lowered your credit score. So you're going through life, living your life, and you're getting denied things. Maybe the grocery store doors closed a little more quickly on you or something, and you don't know the implications of this learning algorithm. That's what can be scary. And it's not just the data, it's actually the usage of the data or the usage of the algorithms. There's multiple places in which we need to be having circuit breakers. And one more thing about that, which is we need to be careful to not just say things are secure or unsecure, things are valuable or not valuable, things should be locked down or open. Because we've locked down data with HIPAA, but I'd suggest that we don't want HIPAA level lockdowns in many other pieces of data. I was visiting a physician at Sloan Kettering, considering her for a board seat on one of the companies I sit on, and she, at her job, couldn't access her own health records because of HIPAA. And she was sitting there for a bit of time, realizing she was on the wrong computer to be accessing her own health records because of HIPAA. This is counterproductive.
So as far as what we do to educate consumers, I think that there's a lot we can do because, more and more these stories are coming into the news, but they're mostly the scary stories. It's mostly the, my Ring camera has been spying on my 8-year-old and things like that. So consumers are learning more. I just don't know that they're learning things that are productive right now. And so one of the things that I think is a really interesting idea, to go back to that idea of a label, and actually also to go back to the idea of standards, is something like NIST MUD profiles or manufacturer's usage descriptions, and tying those in and educating consumers about that, where essentially this MUD profile would be something that a manufacturer would build into a device. And it would say, my device is supposed to work in this way. These are its parameters. And when it talks to the router, your router is saying constantly, okay, are you doing the thing that you're supposed to do? And if it's not, if there's something very strange happening, then your router could kind of, shut it off for a minute, or maybe not shut it down, but kind of keep it to itself, gate it in a little bit so that it doesn't have access to the full network. And if your device has that MUD profile and it's, speaking correctly with the router, then you could get a label on your device that says this device is at least a little bit more secure. And you could scan that code as a consumer and have something on your phone that says, okay, my device is acting how it's supposed to do. But giving users that kind of control, giving them something to do, where if they get a ping on their phone that says your device is not doing what it's supposed to, having the ability to say, okay, stop doing that, would do a lot for consumer education and awareness, I think. And I think in general too, labels take a long time to get to the point where everyone everywhere knows what they mean, but they're at least a really solid start. And I think that's something we could spend more time investing resources into.
Jamie, seems like you want to jump in here real quick.
I'm a little skeptical of labels, and my association has been, I think, a little skeptical of labels, I think for a variety of reasons. For me, I'm not sure as a consumer, even I would necessarily know what to do with a label. And certainly, labels can change over time and that can be taken into account, and consumer understandings and attitudes can be taken into account. I'm just not totally sold that that is necessarily the most informative thing for consumers. But I think it's, something we certainly can continue thinking about and talking about. And I know we've worked with you all on this in the past. So I think for us, you mentioned the supply chain before, Clara, and so I think we're trying to work a little bit up the supply chain. So one example that I'll share is that with respect to the work we've done on Convene the Convener C2, we've started working with some of our manufacturer members and some of our retailer members to try to help them put the baseline capabilities that, our folks have put on paper into the actual sort of sales process. So, for example, we recently shared with some of our retailer members what we call a retailer kit, which is basically like, here is how you take the C2 capabilities and then you actually make sure that the devices that manufacturers are putting into your stores comply with C2. And we actually did this in part because we had heard from manufacturers and we had heard from retailers who were concerned that in California and in Oregon, there were new cybersecurity laws that went into effect this year, and they were kind of like, we don't know what to do with this, right? We don't know how to feel like we're complying. We don't know how to feel like we're not going to get into trouble. And so we do say at CTA, like, we don't do compliance, right? If you want to worry about compliance, call an attorney. But at the same time, we feel like appropriate education and appropriate interaction with folks in all areas of the supply chain that are our members just helps with accountability on all ends. And so, I think it's an ongoing process that we're going to be working on in the near term to try to work with the retailers and work with the manufacturers to try to help them put processes into place to make sure that the devices they are selling are safe.
Go ahead, Sasha. Do you want to say a few things?
Sure. I think I have a different perspective. I actually agree with a lot of what was just said. I just think we think of it in a different way. On the Hill, I think one of the main things is what you brought up in your opening is the terms and services that you click through when you're approving an app or getting to a new website or whatever it may be needs to be written in plain English. What that actually means, we're still figuring out, but in a short, concise way for a consumer at any education level to understand what it is they're giving up when they're consenting to give up their data. So if you're saying, okay, I have an Apple Watch right here, and I say, yes, it can listen to my heart rate when I'm working out. Well, I don't want my Apple Watch or Apple to sell my data to my insurance carrier saying, oh, Sasha only walks 2,000 steps a day. Maybe her insurance is going to be a little higher than Jamie, who walks 15,000 steps a day. That's not an acceptable use of that data unless I actually know that that is what they're going to be using that for. So educating consumers on what it is they're consenting to, I think, is a big piece for us. And the second piece, which is a little less known, is privacy by design. So when you go into a website or an app and you have to try to figure out how to turn off or on your privacy settings, if it takes 15 different clicks to get into the right screen to do that, someone who's just not tech savvy isn't going to be able to figure out how to turn on or off their privacy settings in any capacity. So making it simple for them to get to that area, that seems like it should be a very straightforward piece for a consumer, but a lot of companies out there currently have them hidden because they never had to put them out in the front of their sites. It was never an issue when they were designing their sites in the first place. So I think those are two pieces at the government level that we're kind of focusing on. So
Can I also just say, I feel like research is really important. And I mean, in my association, we actually do a ton of research that we share with our members. And so we've done studies on consumer attitudes towards privacy. And I unfortunately can't share it with you because they're members only. But, I think that having better data about what consumers care about and what consumers are worried about and what consumers genuinely expect from the market is really important. Before we kind of just slap a bunch of requirements out there. I think we actually need to understand what it is consumers want before we try to line up something that may or may not match what they actually are concerned about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I want to make sure we have enough time for questions at the end. I did want to say one thing that I haven't really heard discussed that I wanted to wrap with is really there are a lot of people that are the most vulnerable to these kind of privacy and security implications. And these are people that are most subjective to disinformation, most subjective to, not really quite navigating the digital literacy landscape. And they are vulnerable to all types of threats. And you see this happen with a number of people giving up their data that don't even know that's being done. And huge secondary implications from access to insurance, healthcare, et cetera, that come from interconnected devices. When you think about a heart rate monitor that kind of picks up something else that could then be sent to an insurance broker, right? So these devices we have today are collecting everything at any point, and if you don't know how to turn it off, it is huge on what it could do for the generation of millennials and Gen Zs that grow up having everything on and constantly on. So with that, I want to thank our panelists. I did want to make sure we had time for everyone here to ask questions, so feel free to raise your hands if you have any questions that you want to bring up. Yes, and I will actually give, I don't know if there's someone passing a mic or Josh.
I can do it.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you. I'm Gary Ireland from Ireland Communications. Although the session is described as dealing with 5G, your one question, your sort of non-answer, leaves a lot of room for more discussion about how 5G figures into this. Who keeps the data? How secure is it? Who's liable for gaps either in the short distance 5G signals or anything in the network? So do any of you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So
And I will say to Jamie, at CES, there was a lot of talk about 5G, but not really a lot of movement on it.
Remember, 5G is all it is more bandwidth. It's an order of magnitude more mobile bandwidth. So it does really nothing to do with the sharing of data, except that it'll facilitate the sharing of data just that much more quickly. The same thing with the Internet of Things. There's nothing done. Yes, but that's the difference. It's not that there's going to be new data available. It's that it'll facilitate just the sharing of data. Same way the Internet of Things will just facilitate the collection of more data. That's all it is. I love the idea of just having circuit breakers. I think this is actually the place that I would go with this conversation, is instead of standards, instead of labels, even though I love the idea of labels, the easy place to go is just a lot of circuit breakers. This technology generally affords itself an enormous, just like an unfathomable increase in our productivity. And so we can afford to augment that productivity with circuit breakers. That's I think actually the best way, perhaps, to be mindful of how this is affecting our lives.
And I would just say very briefly on that, I mean, the same risks that we're going to face from these devices, the actual devices that set up these networks, are the same that are plaguing our individual devices as well. There are security flaws across the board. And so in my mind, when we're talking about principles or properties of or frameworks for IoT security, it's inclusive of all kinds of devices, including these 5G devices or the things that will create the network of.
I did want to add, from a national security lens, there is a right now race to 5G against China and a number of, supply chain implications. So that was what I was trying to pick at, not to pick on you, Sasha, on that question. But Jamie, I know, I don't know if you wanted to respond anything from the, CES side from the 5G discussions there.
No, I mean, I think anything I would say you probably wouldn't be happy with. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're excited about 5G, and we're sure. I mean, we're cognizant of the risks, which is why we've been trying to be proactive on security and on privacy. And I don't know that we're looking at 5G any differently per se than we're looking at 4G and all the devices that are out there right now. But well, sure. But yeah.
Great. I did want to make sure we get to a couple more questions. Go ahead. I know the mic's going to come to you. And then if we run over time, these panelists will be here. We can do one-on-one question and answer. So.
Raymond Shea at Georgetown University and NIST. It's been almost 2 years since the GDPR was enacted. A lot of overlap. Do you have any comments about what we've learned in the meantime, things that worked and didn't, that might inform where we go from here?
Yeah, so I live in California, where we have taken the lead of GDPR and we have implemented a privacy system. I will say this is a pain in the butt for small internet companies, small e-commerce companies. For them, it's a burden. The statistics I've heard is it costs a few million a year to comply with that system. And the advantages go towards large firms. in these regulations. So we need to be careful about how we implement them. I think California hopefully will be flexible and learn from these, but that's what we've learned. One thing I can say as a researcher about which I'm skeptical about both of these implementations is that they go a lot into the explainability of AI rather than just looking at the outcome. In the financial markets, we often just look at outcome. Are the trades made within a certain band, and then you know you got a fair trade? We don't actually look at the microstructure of the markets for every single trade that happened. So I would encourage in these regulations just to look at the outcomes necessarily, and we might be okay with having black boxes.
I know that we are at time, so if you would like to get up and leave, that's perfectly fine. We'll keep shooting off questions for others that want to stay in this room. So let's go ahead with you over there.
Thanks. So fantastic panel, thank you. I wanted to tie us back to the panel on privacy, where there seemed to be consensus that notice and choice is not going to be the path forward. There's sort of a spectrum where Jamie's talked about the C2 side of things, which is built around finding other gating points in the ecosystem, whereas some of the labeling, and I'm not quite sure how this would be enacted in the world. So maybe you could talk a little bit about who's expected to pay attention to the labeling model or these Halcyon principles, and how are they supposed to, digest it for make good choices?
Yeah, I guess I could talk a little bit about that, and I think Josh can also talk about it too if he wants on the Halcyon hat. But the goal of these principles was there was a couple of thought leaders that got together, including myself, Eric, a few others, to really think about a multi-stakeholder set of principles that different people could adopt. But the big missing seat at the table is really something small and medium-sized companies that may or may not have the resources to really think about this from a proactive standpoint, something that they can look through and think about from the early onset of building new devices or building new relationships with other companies that include interconnected systems at play. So that is initially just an early framework that was created. I don't know, Eric, if you would like to talk a little more.
Yeah, I'd say. Yeah, I'd say the point of the principles is maybe a little bit like the Constitution. It's to facilitate a conversation. It is to frame. It is to frame the conversation around which we then can put standards or circuit breakers in place and have the appropriate nuances. One part that's appropriate when we talk about technology is that there's even other parts that we don't know. I would encourage the funding. If you're going to fund research, there's a Dr. Lori Craner, and then separately Dr. Kathleen Carley, who have done research on security and privacy, where they are introducing in the case of Dr. Carley, cyber social security, knowing that if Jeff Bezos can get hacked, then the issue isn't necessarily in stronger security protocols for most all applications. The issue is socially, psychologically, we're just vulnerable. And we need to figure out how we become less vulnerable in some critical contexts. And the point of the principles is to just be able to facilitate the framework of the conversation that enables those technologies.
And can I just say one quick thing to kind of piggyback off of all of that? If the FTC ends up being the primary enforcement authority on consumer privacy, they're going to go through an NPRM process, a notice of proposed rulemaking, where there are avenues for public comment, and having a vetted out comprehensive set of principles or standards or whatever it may end up being from different organizations is going to help them figure out what is important to consumers and companies, small and large, and think tanks and academia. It's just more information for them to build off of when they're making their rules. So
so we actually might get kicked out of this room, so I wanted everyone to give a round of applause for all of our panelists. We will stick around for a little bit, so if you have questions, come on to each of us. We're happy to take them on. So.